91.
Now, for you people here on the Welsh Island Railway today, I'm sure I have no need to explain that transport systems were vital to the development of the industry and were also vital to encouraging people to take an interest in the slate industry. One reason we know so much about the slate industry is because they had these fascinating narrow gauge railway systems which people found very, very interesting to study, not just the Festiniog and the Townsend railways, but the internal quarry railways, and people became interested in exploring the quarries themselves for their own sake. But a word about the railway systems. The first railway in the industry was installed at Penrhyn Quarry in 1801 and to connect the quarry with the sea. Cast iron rails, oval section cast iron rails, and borrowing from technology already established to serve the canals of South Wales. Now, whether this was simply a piece of good fortune or whether it was a rationally considered process, I do not know. But in establishing a 2-foot gauge railway system, they hit on something that proved remarkably effective, not just for the circumstances of slate quarrying, but for many other industrial purposes as well. You can move a decent payload on a 2-foot gauge railway, but you can also push a wagon by hand, or have a horse move it, or when the time came, you could construct a steam locomotive capable of pulling a train on these things, but one that wouldn't cost you too much and wouldn't take up too much space. So, for instance, well, here's one of my favourite views of a quarry railway system. Dinorwig Quarry, in the last few years of its operation, great rake of inclined planes going up to the top of Garrett, and levels coming off it, and these distinctive crate wagons, which in various particular designs were found all over these railways. Festiniog, Tanythrin, Dinorwig, Corris, they all made use of these little crate-sided wagons, carrying, as I say, between 2 and 3 tons each of a good slate quarry, and that was workable rock. There's a good vein of rock in the middle, and all the rock on either side is about good enough to put a roof on a pigsty, and that really is about it. Because there was such a huge demand for slate by the middle of the 19th century, there's a boom that goes on from 1856 to about 1876, so some glimpse in the middle. Slate quarrying becomes big business, and many people saw it as a very profitable investment. Well, it wasn't necessarily a very profitable investment, and Gorsedd Quarry is an example of one that isn't. That's from an archaeological and historical point of view excellent, because it's left us with a textbook example of how slate quarries functioned in the middle of the 19th century. Not too far from the coast, we'll open up a quarry, and as soon as they did so, they started realising that the slate was really quite rubbish once you moved away from that central vein. You'll see some of that in the quarry. Another fundamental mistake, or no, there were 2 other fundamental mistakes made here. It was all run by people from Manchester. The village they set out was obviously set out by somebody who had a ruler, a pencil, and a map, and he just got the ruler out with 3 streets, without realising that the topography of the place was totally hopeless. It just goes up and down. And the third mistake they made was the big mill down there, which is based on a foundry design, possibly based specifically at one of Miles Platting, just outside Manchester. And they had no real idea how to build a slate mill, so they put this rather inappropriate type of building there and got a local stonemason to erect it and to try and fit the machinery in. He had to do a fair amount of bodging.
to do that. So it was really a good example of how not to do it. The Victorians did mess some things up quite spectacularly, and this is one of them. But archaeologically, that's good because it didn't last. The road, and the three parallel streets, remember I was saying at the time we put the rule there 3 times on the map, radiate off this along the contour. So depending on how much time we've got later on, whether we do or don't go up there, I'll just tell you now. The village itself is 18 semi-detached houses, so 36 separate dwellings, little cottage buildings, typical rural architecture. Each of them had a strip of land. Those of you who know Mynydd Llandigai, above Tregarth, Bethesda Way, it was an attempt to do something similar to that. And there was a lot of theorising in the mid-19th century about how optimally to house people in semi-industrial, semi-rural circumstances. And you do see similar settlements in Scotland, elsewhere in Wales, and in India, in British India. It was obviously considered a possible way of housing people in British India. So, you know, all these colonies, if you like. This was a wretched place. People seemed to get cholera all the time, and I suspect it was where the naughty boys and the naughty boys' families came to live. People had fallen out with other quarry managers. They'd heard that there was work available here, so all right, we'll go there in that case. But like the quarry itself, of course, it didn't last very long at all. It would be nice to get some archaeologists to have a proper excavation on some of these sites. Who knows, might happen one day.
And that side?
And that side is a farmhouse, one of several quite large farmhouses put up by the Brinker estate. Whether farming is any more successful here than quarrying, I really don't know.
It's an amazing view.
Yes, oh yeah, the view would be lovely.
Obviously you can graze sheep here in reasonable numbers profitably, or they wouldn't be there now.
Well, on the other hand, the Brinker estate was not renowned for its forward planning.
Right.
I don't know. I wouldn't have liked to have gone surety for them, for their bankers in the late 19th century. Let's put it like that. The name of the village, by the way, is Treforys, Morris's town, and it's named after Richard Morris Griffith, who was a Bangor solicitor, or some would say loan shark, who put up money for the construction of this place. I have an idea that Spooner may have worked with him at some stage as well, but don't quote me on that. Anyway, if people are ready to carry on, is a little road carriage shed, a stable, and a tackle store, and it's later than the railway and the quarrying operations, and it dates from the time when the quarry manager's house, of which there is precious little left, was a fishing lodge. The quarry manager's house is in the trees here, sheltered of course from where the plebby quarryman actually worked, and was rather a nice building, considerably blown up as a training exercise by the forestry, I think in the 1960s. But it did have a reputation for being haunted, so it wasn't necessarily the most popular place for fisher people to come and stay. So I think this is late 19th century, if not very early 20th century. There is supposed to be a book coming out one day about the Gorsedd Quarry, not by me, I hasten to add. So that will give us all chapter and verse, if it does get published before too long.
Why did the Forestry Commission, as a training exercise, decided they had to blow something up?
Sorry, it was the Territorial Army, but by discussion with the forestry.
Ah, right.
They were always doing that. I mean, there's a very nice steam engine house just above Tannable Station,
that was more or less intact until the Territorial Army and the Forestry Commission got into their heads to blow it up. And likewise in the Gwydir Forest, I do recall as a child that there was a nice engine house which suddenly wasn't there, and I was told that the TA had, you know, people like blowing things up, I suppose, but even then I felt it was much better not to destroy historic structures. And that one is, you know, it's amazing how attitudes change. There is a picture of this, I think, in Catherine's Place, and it's quite an attractive little house, double fronted house.
I used to live near Stafford Castle. My mum always told me it was a Victorian folly. And so many people thought it was a Victorian folly. The county council blew half of it up and deemed to be unsafe. Which has now been restored, including the bit that blew up.
Just to give some privacy and a bit of status.
Were these trees planted by the forest land, or have they grown up since spontaneously?
I think they were planted in the quarry period.
Right.
You know, I think the attempt was to create a little, almost a parkland area here to show the status of the manager.
Why these rhododendrons? Is the rhododendron?
Yeah, so it's, you know, you can see a late 19th century garden here, just about. Of course, nobody's tended it much since, well, really not since the 1860s, the fishing community.
Right, if we're okay. Stuff is trimming waste from when they're cutting the ends of the split slates with a knife.
So those buildings there to do the work?
Yes, yeah, they're split as shelters. Yeah. Interestingly, they're quite different from the normal run.
So there were a few tiles.
Yeah. Oh yes, yes. There was a roofing slate output here. But those are much more like splitter shelters you find in the Lake District.
Yeah.
Which is strange. May just be coincidence. I don't know.
But although if the bulk of the people running it were Mancunians, they'd have knowledge of that perhaps.
They might do. There's no evidence that they got them in from the Lake District. God only knows. I mean, there was a Bavarian guy, Henry Tobias Tschudi von Uster, who was involved with this, and God knows how he got involved and what his role was.
I suppose in the end you go where the money is, and if it's paying well, at least for a short time, you might get them coming down.
Yes. But, you know, Michael Lewis has done some extensive research, and I don't think he's faced anybody from the Lake District. Non-quarrymen can see that. You know, you get something out of that. That's it.
Narrow, isn't it?
Yes.
Start.
Yeah. Oh, you can see why someone says, "Well, it's good rock there," and then, you know, after a year or so digging, I thought, "Oh dear, okay. This was a mistake." Like naive investors. And they thought, oh, you know, it's rather like under Thatcher, to be honest, in the 80s, you know, the idea of creating a shareholding democracy. So we'd all become mini capitalists. And the people said, oh, slate quarries, oh, that's a good way to make money. I mean, the other one was, another one was copper mining.
Lead, wasn't it? The Klondike mine.
Yes.
They painted that silver, didn't they? So
yes,
getting
yes,
the silver mine.
yes, that's where the dodgy guy
Yeah.
had the Chinese students and the widowed ladies. Yes.
I always found it quite amazing how many Victorian mega projects kind of went bust and everything. It's not just today where everything goes
Oh no, no.
massively over budget. We don't think about it.
No, no. Well, I mean, every railway in the 19th century seems to have come in massively over
Yeah.
budget.
I don't think that's the point. I think the point is that that structure is then there, and then it's once it's there that everything kind of expands off it. It's the fact that you've got these transport routes already in place, I think, that allows the rest of the industry to expand.
Well, there's a theory that although railways, say in rural areas of the United Kingdom, never made money for themselves, they did massively benefit the areas through which they passed. And a farm labourer, apparently, you know, somewhere around Welshpool, or somewhere Perignon, as soon as the railway arrived, his income would go up by about 50%, admittedly only from about 15 bob to, you know, £1.05 shillings, but there was a knock-on effect. And I think that's why, you know, the Earl of Powys might have invested in it, because he knew he wouldn't get shares back from the railway, but he might get more profitable rents from his farms.
It's surprising how much fresh produce was being sent to London and stuff, isn't it? Strawberries and...
Yeah, and people's health got better because they could, you know, drink fresh refrigerated milk that came in on a railway train.
Were these slabs broken by wedges or were they blasted?
They would have blasted here. You can see, though, I'm not entirely sure where, and it would be at risk to life and limb, where they had a particular type of hand drill for putting the blasts in.
So how did they... how far up did the railway come? How the hell did they get it from round that corner?
You know, the wagons would have been right there at the foot of the rock. So
you have to bring it round that corner to work it down.
yeah, you'd have you know, pushed it along with crowbars. You'd have had a little crane to load it in the wagon. You'd have taken it round there to that shelter, split it, then you'd have put it on one of the bigger wagons, or if it was a block going to the mill, you'd have done the same. You'd have put it on the wagon, then somehow or other you'd have had to make sure that you had the floors of the wagons at more or less the same level, and you'd have had to push it over.
Yeah.
You know, the number of thumbs that would have been broken and sweat that would have been poured to keep this place going doesn't bear thinking about. Okay, it's 5 to 4.
Now the Mabinogi, there are 4 stories in the Mabinogi, and they have been included. They were translated in the 19th century by a lady called Lady Charlotte Guest, and she included then some more stories that were in the manuscripts in Llyfr Coch Hergest. These are medieval manuscripts, and so she published these translations in a book called The Mabinogion. So the Mabinogion has the Mabinogi in it, and Mabinogi in Welsh means youth, or the story of the youth. So I'm not going to try and tell you all the stories from the Mabinogion tonight. I'm not even going to try and tell you all the stories from the Mabinogi, because we will be here for a long time. So I thought, because we're here in Dinas tonight, and we're looking out over the Foryd and down to Dinas Dinlla, and behind us is the Ffrynanlle, that I would tell the stories, well, couple of stories from the fourth branch of the Mabinogi. And the fourth branch of the Mabinogi is called Math Fab Mathonwy. Math Fab Mathonwy. Math, the son of Mathonwy.